Thank you, Mr. Franks. God has given us this place in 2009, and so this is the administration we have to look to. But you're right, we should look prospectively at all administrations, and the two wrongs don't make a right and all those other things. Mr. Kennedy, what are the particular rules that came into place in the last 90 days or so that are most dangerous to the environment?
The rules that I mentioned, which was the buffer zone rule that got rid of the 100-foot buffer around streams, these are the rules, the hazardous waste exemption rule. This is the rule that exempts hazardous waste that can be burned as fuel. So it can be burned in incinerators. It's about 3 million tons of highly toxic hazardous waste every year. What we know about that waste is that about 80% of the people who handle that, they're exempt from all the requirements of RCRA, that they safely handle it, that they safely transport it, that they inventory it and document it, that the people who transport that, 80% of them have been cited in the past for violating the laws in this area. For example, trucking companies, small trucking companies that take a load of PCBs, and instead of bringing them to the dump and documenting them, they just dump them out on the road or something like that. And essentially all of this waste, anything that essentially can be burned in an incinerator, is now exempt from the requirements of RCRA. Under the Endangered Species Act, another regulation which is very, very damaging, which we think, again, is one of the ones we've selected that ought to be reviewed under the Congressional Review Act. Normally, if the Department of Defense takes an action that is going to endanger a species, that's going to further endanger a listed species, they have to do a consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service and with or with NIMFs. In the past, there's been 70,000 of these consultations done, and only 5% of the actions have been altered or stopped. So it's not a huge administrative burden. It doesn't stop the agency from doing things that it wants to do, but it plays a valuable role. Now, what the new rule says is that they don't have to do that consultation. They can do an internal evaluation about whether or not there's going to be a problem, and then just go ahead and do it without consulting, without any public notice, without consulting any of the other agencies of government. Again, the CAFO rule, the factory farm rule, is another critical one. One of the midnight rules was an oil shale leasing rule that waives any kind of sensible or just fundamental controls for oil shale drilling on 20 million acres of public land in the western states. We don't know what the oil shale drilling is going to look like. We don't know what the industry is going to look like. The industry doesn't exist today. We ought to be able to look at that industry, say, here are the best available technologies, let's do this. Instead, the new regulation just says, here's 2 million acres and do anything you want with it. And we're not going to have any federal controls over what you do. Doesn't make any sense.
Let me ask you this. I understand the policy considerations that you have and we share, but are you familiar with procedural defects in the implementation of any of these regulations that we should specifically look at in terms of reforming or repealing these regulations if there was due process denials?
The endangered species regulation, for example, and this is in the testimony, received something like 150,000 comments in the narrow comment period that they opened. And that each comment, some of these comments were 20 or 30 pages long. They were very well thought out. They were filed by interest groups all over the country. These comments were given on average. The reviewers who were charged with reviewing them were given on average a minute to review every 9 of those comments. Some of those comments could have been 20 or 40 pages long, and they had to review 9 a minute. So this is not, this is not what we think of when we think of American democracy, where there's an opportunity to participate.
Was there a problem there with the regulatory review process that's in law or in fact
No,
the process that was used?
Again, I would focus less on the process than on, looking at some of these regulations and how they were done, rather than reforming the whole regulatory review process, which I think is burdensome enough to pass the regulations. I would hesitate to put more burdens on passing of regulations. I think that it takes 8 years at this point to pass a regulation if you do it properly. What I would do is look at these specific regulations, how they were done, and many of these violated the current regulatory process in order to get passed. And I would take a look at that. That is outlined in my testimony, and I assume the testimony of the other panelists that they experienced the same kind of problems with their regulations, where there were shortcuts taken, where there was regulatory procedures that were ignored, and that these regulations just slipped through. They literally were midnight regulations. They weren't just regulations that happened to be passed during January or December. They were literally jammed through and ignored the regulatory process.